How's it going, everybody? This is Tre Bell. I'm with Johnathan Cridford of the new Musical Chairs, and this is Arcane Frequencies. And today we are going to be discussing the one and only band, Death in June. All right, I'm just get straight to this and announce the elephant in the room that everyone knows that surrounds the controversies of this band. Death in June, Douglas P, one of the pioneers of NeoFolk when it comes to that subgenre. Of course, anyone who's watched me on my Current 93 videos knows I've extensively have talked about Death in June synonymously with Current 93, knowing their very close-knit associations. And um, this is a band I've been aware of for a while, but obviously upon discovery, yeah, you can imagine like why I probably have been avoided of talking about this band, but uh I'm just pretty much going to start the video out like this with a good disclaimer, and then we can just like get into the meat and potatoes of this video. All right.
Sure.
So, this video slash podcast is an objective exploration of the band Death in June, led by Douglas Pearce, focusing on their significant role in the experimental and neo-folk music scene that emerged in the UK during the 1980s and 1990s. It is important to address that Death in June has been a subject of controversy due to their heavy use of fascist and Nazi symbolism in their imagery in music. The aim of this video slash podcast is to provide a historical perspective of the band's career and influence within the music genre, rather than to support or condemn their use of such symbols. I want to make it unequivocally clear that I, as the creator of this content, Tre Bell, along with Johnathan Cridford, do not endorse or support any fascist, Nazi, or extremist ideologies. The presence of such symbolism in Death in June's work has undeniably attracted a following that includes far-right individuals, some of which I'm aware may watch some of my content. However, it is crucial to understand that not all listeners or fans of Death in June align with these extreme viewpoints. My intention is to present an unbiased analysis that respects the complexity of the band's artistic expression while acknowledging the problematic nature of their symbolic choices. This video slash podcast is produced for educational and historical purposes, aimed at providing insight into the development of neo-folk music and its cultural impact. Bands like Current 93, Soul Invictus, and of course primarily Death in June are seen as the sole pioneers of the neo-folk genre, along with Tony Wakeford, creator of Soul Invictus, being an original founding member of Death in June before leaving the band in 1984. By examining Death in June, we can better understand the broader context of the music scene and the diverse influences that have shaped it. This exploration is not an endorsement of any political or ideological stance, but a commitment to documenting and understanding the varied facets of music history, especially in the niche underground scenes throughout time. Lastly, I encourage all viewers and listeners to approach this content with an open mind and a critical perspective. While discussing controversial topics, it is essential to engage thoughtfully and respectfully, recognizing the difference between exploring a subject academically and endorsing the ideologies associated with it. Also, lastly, any antagonistic or hateful comments on this video coming from any extremists, either on the left or right, or just or just internet trolls trying to get a rise out of people, will not be tolerated, and your comments will be deleted and blocked. With that said, thank you for watching slash listening and for your willingness to delve into this complex and thought-provoking band. All right. So, I guess I'll start off with like how I got into
Sure.
Death in June, and then I'll pass it off to you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
So pretty much probably like anyone who discovered like one of any artists or band within this genre of like the industrial neo-folk underground, you know, a lot of these artists and bands that I figured out about primarily it came from Current 93.
Sure.
And for my beginning subscribers, everyone knows I've already have talked about this band and some of my concerns, but interest in wanting to like understand the history of like you know, what this band has played a role in when it comes to like the neo-folk genre and primarily the association with Current 93 since I've always been a big Current 93 fan. And so I was my introduction to Death in June was very scattered. And what I mean by that is like upon discovering Current 93 and doing research, you will see these bands and artists tacked on with like the earlier stages of, Current 93 projects and different associations. So I was always seeing the name Death in June pop up. And I wouldn't say it was probably around the Swastikas for Naughty era of like when I was listening to that album where I had a glimpse and awareness that on the song Hello Angel was a Death in June song based on just the way that he sounded and also knowing that Douglas P has a very specific voice, so it was really easy to pick
Yeah.
up in my early Current 93 days that like okay, whoever this Death in June person or group is, this has to be them because I think I heard a soundbite of Douglas P saying "A Death in June on a Minstrel Moon" on the song "Beau Soleil" off of Swastikas for Naughty. So that it in itself kind of already like I guess slightly introduced me to them without fully being aware of what they were because I wasn't really that interested in getting into other bands in this genre until I got through most of the Current 93 discography because Current 93 at the time was a really challenging group for me to listen to anyway. So I was like, before I explore anywhere else, I'm just going to stick with this one band. And I've already said that in my previous Current 93 videos where it's like, yeah, I'm just sticking with this one band for a few years until like I get a
Mhm.
general understanding of this type of music. And when
Yeah.
I'm ready and mature to actually dive deep, because there is rabbit holes upon rabbit holes upon rabbit holes. And I was like, all right, let let's just stick with Current 93 for a bit and then if I eventually get to these other bands then cool. So fast forward 2017, I'm listening like to some Current 93 on my YouTube play or something and you know how it like will recommend similar content, so it was just on autoplay and like I think I was listening to a Current 93 song in my like apartment at the time when I was in college, and I remember just like seeing the Sundogs EP, which was in the shape like which were four dogs with a rose in the middle in the shape of a
Yeah.
swastika. And granted, most likely I was probably listening to Swastikas for Naughty or something, and so it just went to that. And I kind of was like, wasn't too concerned when it came to David and his use of those symbols because I could tell that like that really wasn't probably who his character was. But then when I saw like Death in June and saw that album cover and then also the song Rose Clouds for Holocaust, that's when I started like raising an eyebrow of like, okay, what is this music about now? Because
Yeah.
I was concerned from the beginning from Dog's Blood Rising, like when it came to songs like Falling Back and Feels of Rape again, I'm just like, all right, very intense, but like maybe there's a meaning behind it. This
Sure.
definitely kind of put me like at a oh Jesus Christ. Okay, what am I getting myself into? And while listening to Rose Clouds of Holocaust, I liked the song. It's just I just had so many questions of like, are they serious about this, or is like this really is their main way of thinking when it comes to like making music? And so I think I don't remember doing that. I think I did some research, but like I kind of was just like a little bit scared of like, all right, what is Current 93 about? I didn't really care about Death in June at the time. I was like, all right, let me make sure like Current 93 isn't into some shit. And so I think at that time, the first time I tried giving it like their music a shot just to because I was getting into Current 93 more and I was very curious about NeoFolk. And it was pretty obvious that Death in June was like, you know, neck and neck with Current 93 when it comes to like their influence in the genre. So I was like, all right, I'll try to listen to some albums. And I remember listening to The Guilty Has No Pride. And again, this is still around 2017. And I think I just wasn't used to like the post-punk sound because like I
Mm.
was initially just wanting to hear like the neo folk sound. And I was like, all right, I'll listen to this maybe one day, but like not now. And plus it gave me just very weird vibes just being aware of
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
So and then now from 2017, fast forward to 2021 when I actually started this channel and I started talking about death and I mean talking about Current 93. And it was like it was always in the back of my mind that I want to talk about death in June. I just don't know how to go about it. And thanks to a lot of subscribers like who have commented on like my videos, mentioning death in June and how I should approach them and do like very intense research before actually delving into them. Thank you, because I did. And for the most part, yeah, like I still don't know what to make of his music after all these years, but I have gone through the whole entire catalog. I like the music, but when it comes to the politics around him in any sort of way, like I tend to just tread lightly and just try to hear like the different perspectives to like not get into any specific like realms of like conflicts. I'm just because for me, this a lot of this music was just purely wanting to like enjoy music objectively and understand experimental industrial music and where that like road took like the avant-garde sound. And while I can say that like it's been a nice journey of listening to them for like a year or so and doing as much research, but goddamn, it's a very complex rabbit hole that to this day I still like, you know, am learning more stuff and not always entirely sure how to say or explain this band to people. It's just kind of they're just it's just kind of up in the air of like, yeah, this is just what they are. So that's kind of as much as I have to say about that, Jonathan.
yeah. Well, for me, getting into Death in June was kind of the opposite way round because Current 93 were I got into them at university. I believe I said this in our first Current 93 video that we did. I got into them through a friend at university who at the time was listening to much more adventurous music than I was. Um, and so, and I was, as we talked about before, I was I sat with Current 93 for a very long time and kind of went through the catalogue. And actually, when Trey and I did the videos last year talking about Current 93, it was a brilliant opportunity to kind of reappraise that catalogue. And I'd forgotten, I'm going to take these out because they're not doing anything. While I mention it, if I sound terrible, if the audio is terrible from my point of view, that's because it is. It's coming out of my laptop because we were having audio issues before we jumped onto this. My microphone just stopped working. I have no idea why, but it was either cancel and reschedule for a later date or carry on. And we've chosen to carry on because Trey and I, our schedules at the moment are quite busy. And we felt that we've been kind of sitting on this video for quite some time. So full disclosure, but Death in June, I almost came back around to as a result of Trey and I starting to talk to each other. I had been aware of them for quite some time. I had read um, England's Hidden Reverse several times and explored them, knew about the controversy around them, uh, and perhaps like a few people, chose not to delve too deeply into the catalogue simply because I kind of thought to myself, well, you know, I will. I need to, a bit like you just said, Trey. I need to make sure I'm fully in the frame of mind to do this. And I'm not a casual listener of music. You know, if I get into a band, I like to listen to the entire discography, ideally in chronological order, to see how they evolve, to see how they start, to see where they end up. And I think you get a much more rounded idea of the people involved if you do that and what their motivations are. I would also recommend at this point, following the disclaimer that Tre read out earlier on, if you haven't watched Death in June, The Politics of Douglas P. By the channel Lines in Wax, do go and watch that now. I'd imagine if you're watching this and you're a Death in June fan, you've probably already seen it because there aren't a lot of these videos around.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think that's a really great starting point as well. And actually, personally, for me, Tre is very much the expert of the two of us here. A little bit of background for me, I took history at college, and so I have a fair degree of knowledge over some of the symbology and iconography that Douglas likes to flirt with. And when I say that, I think it's fairly implicit that you all know what I'm talking about and what period in modern history we're talking about here. I've written several theses on this period of history myself over the years, not from an iconography point of view, but just from a general historical point of view. Um, as Tre said, there is no condoning of any of those behaviors or what those symbols stand for. But it's also worth, this was something Tre and I discussed before we came came on. It's also worth remembering that many of the symbols we will be discussing today, or that might get passing mention, many of these symbols have existed for many hundreds, if not thousands of years, and have had several associations that both predate and post-date, how can I say, what they're best known for.
Yeah.
So I think that's important to say as well, right off the bat. But no, like you said, Tre, just to bring it back to the music for a second, when I started listening to Death in June seriously, my immediate thought was, wow, this is beautiful. Um, and my second thought was, hey, maybe that's why people feel so mixed up about this. Something else we discussed before we joined the call was black metal. Now, I'm a black metal fan, and the Norwegian bands from the Norwegian black metal, true Norwegian black metal scene out of Norway, they have had their share of controversy in the past in a similar vein to Death in June. The difference being, I would argue, is that it's quite evident straight away that black metal music was always meant to be ugly. It was always meant to put up a barrier between itself and the audience to say, you're not meant to like this. And so if you do, here you are in the inner circle, let's call it. Um, Whereas Death in June, there's a little bit more of a problem there because Death in June's music is inviting and it is, for some, in some instances, warm and attractive to listen to. And you could quite easily tune out the topics or the lyrics or the symbology and just enjoy it for what it is. You can do that. And that's where I think perhaps the problem lies and what makes people uncomfortable discussing it. Because on the surface of it, many people, I believe, or many more people, would want to like this music compared to, Mayhem or Bazoom from the black metal scene. And I think that's perhaps where uh, the seesaw tilts in either direction, because this isn't deliberately difficult to listen to. Can be at times. There are albums in this catalogue, a bit like with Current 93, that kind of are almost music concrete and have that real uh, aggressive, harsh, scraping sound to it. But a lot of it isn't like that, you know. Um, to pick a song out of thin air, Rose Clouds of Holocaust, the song, um, is beautiful and you can quite easily fall in love with it. And I do wonder if that's where some of um, the difficulty lies for people.
Yeah. Yeah, I can sorry. Yeah, I can imagine that. Hello? Oh, thank you. Sorry, that was my mom. Um, Yeah, I can imagine that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Um, yeah. So, oh yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Yeah. So to Jonathan's point, the whole concept of like around like the music being very beautiful, and then the imagery and the backstory being very like concerning and divisive is what I feel like makes just the whole aura of Death in June, you know, very difficult to like,
Mm,
penetrate or understand because there's so many elements like going against each other. And honestly, as a whole, I think Douglas himself knows this and enjoys that.
yeah,
And the only comparison I can ever give when it comes to an artist who goes about, you know, his controversy in this type of way, and of course we've discussed this person many of times, and most people are probably going to know who I'm going to say, is Kanye West, and also knowing his associations and interest as of right now and as of late and pretty much throughout his whole entire life of surrounding himself in constant controversy and really capitalizing it while definitely, having it, you know, defile his name. It's also kind of what makes, the allure of him like even more interesting, along with the fact that he also makes very beautiful music and it's somewhat objective at this point because I've met people who've told me that like they hate Kanye West, but once they actually put a album on, they're like, God damn it, I don't want to
yeah.
like
I
it, but
mean,
I like it.
you can't deny the guy's talent, and I think that's something that people struggle to reconcile with a lot of these artists. Is that there's an almost unwillingness to admit when something's good because it's made by an asshole. You know, there unfortunately there are a lot of people in in quote unquote popular music and underground music who aren't the best people. And unfortunately, sometimes it can be because they have had difficult upbringing, sometimes not. And you kind of, you do then start to question their motives and think to yourself, is this just who you are? And there doesn't appear to be a reason for that. But you can't deny good talent when it's there right in your face. And from the moment I heard, I can't, you'll be able to tell me the Kanye track, Trey, but from the moment I heard him um, doing a mix where he had sampled King Crimson, um,
It's
and
probably something off of My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. One of those songs.
yeah,
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember what song it is right now.
as soon as I heard that, and it worked so well with, with his vocal and with the rest of the music. It's from the track Power. I've just looked it up.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Funnily enough, there was a lawsuit over it, but
Not
um,
surprising.
it
Not surprising.
it's brilliantly done. And there is an example of another band who, at the time, they didn't generate the volume of panic that a moral panic, let's say, that other bands from the '60s did. Black Sabbath probably being the biggest example of this. King Crimson they were a dark band and they flirted with some dark imagery. And even Mike Giles, their drummer, their original drummer, you know, as, there's a great document. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here. There's a documentary series called Metal Evolution. In the progressive metal episode of that, Mike Giles is interviewed and he kind of says, the dark side is always attractive, and there is a part in all of us, I think, whether we admit it to ourselves or we choose to use it in our presentation of self and how we want to be perceived or not. There is a part of our brains, and I think this is inherent and kind of some comes from somewhere back here in the lizard brain or the monkey brain or whatever you want to call it, whereby we're inherently kind of intrigued by and attracted to things that perhaps we shouldn't uh, go looking for. You know, it's why if somebody asks me why I like black metal or why I like death metal, some of the more extreme strands of that, I couldn't tell you. And I think we said this in the Coil video actually. Some of this music, I don't know what draws me to it, but I am drawn to it. And I think, you know, many artists who have controversy thrust upon them, perhaps, are not always worth sticking around for. Gigi Allen is an example of that, as we again another one we talked about beforehand. Somebody who um, isn't especially talented, I personally don't believe, and kind of got by on pure shock value. Now you could argue that everything he did was, I mean, it's genius marketing. There's no other way of putting it. But unfortunately, if you're pulled in by the genius marketing and then the records you're listening to aren't very good, you're not going to stick around and you're not going to remember them for anything other than that. And again, I think this is where we have a little bit more of a problem with Douglas and with Death in June, because a lot of the music is so good. Same with Kanye. A lot of the music is so good. And so I think people do have trouble reconciling that. And I've battled with that with artists that I like as well, you know. Particularly I guess in the black metal sphere, because there is an entire subset of bands who deal in National Socialist ideologies. I don't listen to any of them. That's not my thing. And quite honestly, they hark back to a time of black metal and a sound within black metal that's very reductive and very backward looking anyway. Um, but you know, I think people do struggle with that. You know, people struggle to accept that. People struggle to accept the fact, and I need to get this out in the right way, that sometimes you are going to like a piece of art produced by somebody who is unlikable or perceived to be unlikable. Whether that's the case with Douglas, is kind of what we're here to discuss, really. But
Yeah.
yeah,
And before we get into the music, the last point I want to like add into just kind of how you were explaining about bands and groups or artists that, you know, it comes from a very unfortunately, negative or bad person or however you want to like say it, controversial. But there's no denying that like the music itself is still beautiful. And I always think about it in this way, even when it comes to like any artist that like it's just not the things that make the music beautiful just don't come straight from that artist all the time. There's people he's associated with. There's other producers, other influences that probably don't share those ideas, but happen to make their input in those types of music. So I think about like, the back to Kanye, where it's just like, in reality, Kanye is just a small part of it. He's the face of it and the curator. But most of
yeah,
the things we love about Kanye is the people that he has on his albums. A lot of which of
exactly.
people who actually don't even like him all the time that much anymore. They fall in and out with them because of just polarizing personality. Like when I think of like the things that like off of Yeezus or My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, a lot of those instrumentations are coming from completely different people. Like in I'm appreciating like their input. The only thing Kanye ever did was just like get them to um participate because he's such a powerhouse. And I think that's something that people have to understand, that whether it's music, even like shows or anything. Like I think of like, recent like when it comes to allegations, when it comes to some of the creators of like Rick and Morty, people love that show. But one of the dude, like, I think Dan Harmon, yeah, I think that
Yeah,
dude like it's a fucking creep. And it's just like,
yeah,
and got kicked off the show. So it's just like it's not like it's just one person. Like there's multiple people involved in crafting certain musics that's attached to a name. And I think
yeah,
if people if you really think about it when it comes to like your moral ethical like stances on that, take that in consideration and know that like sometimes what you're enjoying is not fully coming from that person. It's just their name is attached to it. And
Yeah,
we're human, so we don't know what people's full ideals are when they associate with people. Some people associate with people purely for business reasons and nothing outside of that. Some people like
yeah,
hate people they associate with, but like, hey, yeah, like I make good music with this person. We make a lot of money. That's the only reason why I'm going to associate with you. So
yeah. I
just
mean,
keep that in mind.
probably one of the most or two of the most famous examples of that. One of the most famous examples, Fleetwood Mac. Two couples who split up in the middle of one of the most successful periods of their career, which then became the most successful period of their career. Everybody still listens to Rumours and that kind of magic run of albums that they had with Christine McVie, John McVie, and the rest of the band, where Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham had split up, and then you had Mick Fleetwood kind of in the middle of all of that. Um, but they all recognized that while they weren't getting on, while two couples were splitting up, they were doing mountains and mountains of cocaine and drugs, drinking a lot. They all recognized the greater kind of good that they were serving, which was Fleetwood Mac itself. And had they all succumbed to that, we'd never have had Rumours, we'd never have had, Tusk or Tango in the Night. None of those albums would have ever been made. And I think, to Tre's point, the people who associate with these artists don't necessarily buy into their worldview, but they recognize good art is good art. Um, and yeah, I think, like we were saying, Kanye and Douglas share this they share this controversial image while being wrapped up in a form of music or forms of music that on the face of it can be quite accessible to people, as opposed to an extreme form of metal or something else that is supposed to be ugly and off-putting and made by people with, let's say, questionable opinions. Um, because certainly with Kanye, there was a time when I thought this is a character. He is effectively satirizing the rock star, the asshole rock star, and effectively doing a bit. Um, I don't think that's true anymore,
No. Yeah.
um, which is a real shame because I think if it had been that, he played everybody and he'd have walked away the victor. But now, as it stands now, a bit like with Marilyn Manson, because I know that a lot of friends of mine, since everything has come out about Marilyn Manson, will not listen to those albums anymore, despite the fact that they've all got Mechanical Animals t-shirts, or hoodies or whatever in the backs of their closets that they dare not get out anymore.
And it's funny you mentioned Marilyn Manson and the fact that like when that stuff came out about him, like I don't want to sound like an asshole in this, but it's just like I was like, are people that surprised? Because I did a deep dive on Marilyn Manson, and just from his content alone, it's just like, yeah, you can say it's artistry, but like, there's certain content I can tell is like, this dude really believes in this type of stuff because
Yeah,
there's just certain energies that people can. I feel like art can still be a mirror of and a
yeah,
reflection of a person, and while in art you kind of have to be like a magician or a manipulator in order for people to buy into it. Especially
yeah,
like
of
since
course.
most music is aimed towards a younger audience, they're not gonna really know the difference. They're just like, this makes me feel good, and that's all I care about. So you also got to take in consideration of the demographics that most of good music made by like questionable people is aimed towards. It's like the audience is not going to be fully aware of all the constructs behind the symbols or words or lyrics that they use in their music. It's just it's mainly the vibration, and then over time, whether they adopt those ideas or not, I think it's all a personal standpoint. It's just like someone's listening to this group for that reason, another person's listening to this same group for a completely different reason, and those two people probably will never like each other, but that like each of their like viewpoints doesn't fully give a clear, concise viewpoint of like who the artists or artists are in general. And
Yeah.
so that's just another food for thought, I think, to take with this. And I think we can get into the music.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So how about this? I want to hear your top five first.
Okay, so I kind of labored over this because um like I said at the top of this, I am way less familiar with this band and with Douglas's work than Trey is. I I had some trouble with some of the late 90s, early 2000s records insofar as I it was reaching for something that I don't believe it achieved. And I really don't like drawing comparisons to other artists, particularly those as closely linked as Death in June and Current 93. But albums such as Operation Hummingbird, Take Care and Control, to a slightly lesser extent, All Pigs Must Die, were perhaps reaching for that kind of um, harsh scraping sound of the early Current 93 records, insofar as they appeared to be driving at something. They were trying to pull at a different emotive core, I believe, than some of the other records. And it didn't land for me in the same way. It felt a little bit forced and a little bit art for art's sake and disingenuous. Um, However, something I did land on and was quite a pleasant surprise to me was Rule of Thirds is my number five. Um, I really enjoyed this album. It's one of his most stripped back. Um, Terrible cover. We'll get into some of those um, later on, I'm sure. Um, because usually it almost feels like it should be a meme at this point, just a sort of shitty digital photo of Douglas in his gear, just stood outside, or you know, in the case of All Pigs Must Die, it just looks like he's sat in a pub or something like that. Um, but I really, really did enjoy Rule of Thirds. Fourth, Wall of Sacrifice from 1989. That was kind of in that magic run that he had once he kind of found his feet a little bit more. Now, interestingly, the title track of this is this kind of 16-minute minimalist thing with keyboards. There's sort of folk chanting on there. There's the military marches on there, which we'll talk about. Um, but I really enjoyed this album. The Giddy Giddy Carousel was disturbing. You've got Rose McDowell on that one as well. She's obviously linked with all of these. Uh, the England's Hidden Reverse set of bands, she's kind of linked across the board with them. Um, I really, really liked In Sacrilege. I thought that was a beautiful, beautiful thing. David Tibet takes the vocal on there. And of course, there's Hello Angel, which was recorded on for Swastikas for Noddy. But I really, really enjoyed this record. And my favourite song on this, Fall Apart, which is covered beautifully, and this is a point I want to make in a moment, covered beautifully by one of my favourite, and to my mind, one of, if not the most, not the most, one of the most underrated post-punk gothic rock bands of all time, I would say. Icon with a K from Australia, not the K-pop band, with spelled the same, who managed to get Icon the post-punk band kicked off of Facebook for infringing on their copyright, even though they existed for about 30 years before they ever showed up. Their cover of Fall Apart is stunning. So a little side there. Number three, but what ends when the symbols shatter? 1992. So we are in kind of this. If you're a Death in June fan, this is fairly untouchable territory, and I'm not going to um, bore you with picking favorites on this because it's all great.
Yeah,
Uh,
like I I cannot choose a single like
Golden Wedding of Sorrow. I have a really uh, perhaps I'll pick that as my favorite simply because if I want to hear some Death in June, that's one of the first songs I will go to. Um, Number two, The World That Summer, which I feel like this album, when I was reading on forums and things like that, watching other people's videos, reading reviews, this album gets kind of forgotten a little bit, which I think is a real shame. This was 1986, so this is pre-Brown Book. This was kind of his first. These are the first tentative steps, morphing from, I guess, a more traditional drum machine driven post punk sound to what would become NeoFolk. This feels when you're listening to this, you feel like you're starting to hear the birth of a new genre or subgenre. Um, but I really like this record. Come Before Christ and Murder Love, I think, is an absolutely stunning track. Um, Tortured by Roses, I really like, but again, I could pick anything on this. Blood of Winter, in fact, I'm just looking at the track listing now. The first side of The World That Summer is just absolutely beautiful. But Come Before Christ and Murder Love would be my favorite on there. And number one, which, I mean, you all know what this is going to be, and it's Rose Clouds of Holocaust. Um, it's it's just so good. It's just so good. It's beautiful. There's the other thing I want to say is as well. There's a lessened reliance on synthetic percussion on this. It's still there, but it's used more sparingly. There are more properly acoustic instruments on this as well. There's vibraphone, there's melodica, trumpet on here. Because God's Golden Sperm is, and 13 Years of Carrion especially. 13 Years of Carrion might be my favorite Death in June song. Um, it's just so perfect, and one of my favorite moments of it's been a really hard year for my partner and I for one reason or another. One of my favorite moments of coming together this year was she was a fantastic jazz trumpet player as a teenager. She put the trumpet down for about 15 years, picked it up again recently. And one of the first things I got her to play was we jammed with the 12 string behind me. We jammed on 13 Years of Carrion and Symbols of the Sun with the trumpet parts in there, which was just, and because she's as talented as she is, she could just pick them up. So that was cool. But and a big bugbear of mine when it comes to acoustic guitar is I really hate when acoustic guitar is DI'd. So if anybody doesn't know what that means, if you have an acoustic guitar that has a pickup in it, you effectively plug the guitar into the desk and just record that sound. And I don't like the sound of DI guitar, acoustic guitar. I just always think it sounds fake and sloppy and just not my thing. I know it has its place and I know a lot of people do it. Um, but what I loved about Rose Clouds of Holocaust is that that's still there, but it's blended with the natural in the room ambience as well. And I just think if you take the title out of the equation and take some of the lyrics out of the equation, this is just such a beautiful album that I think anyone could put on and quite enjoy, you know, just getting soaked in it because it's wonderful. But yeah, that's my top five. Yeah. What about you, Trey?
so my top, I'll be honest, I don't really think I was able to make a concise top five because after going like I didn't get through the whole discography like I told you like I would again, but I did get through the first three albums, because again, I really wasn't that big into their post-punk sound because I was just more attracted to the neo-folk sound after hearing like Rose Clouds of Holocaust for the first time.
If I
But
can just jump in just 1 second, sorry, Trey, before you continue,
oh
I
yeah, go
agree
ahead.
with you. I agree with you. So a lot of people really love Nada, right? I it's it's fine, but for me, they were going for a sound that many bands had already done better and would do better in the future. I know a lot of people really love those early things. I just don't think because they've not found or Douglas hadn't found Death in June's identity yet, they don't work for me.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that because like that's kind of how I've always felt up until like a few days ago, like literally like
Right.
either yesterday or before that. And I had listened to that album and like mainly The Guilty Has No Pride for the first time like all the way through like I guess since 2021 when I first went through the whole entire discography like from
Yeah.
front to back. And now that I have a general a good basis of like the Death in June sound, I was able to appreciate that album more despite the fact I wasn't really into like the post-punk sound. And granted, I still had a whole entire playlist of like any song that sounded interesting to me from each album, and I just consistently played it for a whole entire year just so I can get equipped to understanding what this sound is. Because like I really approached listening to Death in June in a very like textbook fashion of like trying to deep dive into the different like generated sounds of the neo-folk like genre, of course, with associations with like, listening to other artists that really get the core essence of what neo-folk is.
Yeah.
So by doing such a big, deep dive that not honestly probably was the biggest deep dive I've done since Current 93, like I have a newfound appreciation for that album, despite just liking a few of those songs. I think The Guilty Has No Pride is like listening to it, it's just like, oh, okay. Like in retrospect, like there's certain stuff that I would hear on my favorite like neo folk forms of Death in June that I would like be able to see the precursors on with The Guilty Has No Pride. It's just I didn't have the best frame of reference. So
I'm
recently
really glad you said that.
it recently got put on my top five. What were you gonna say?
I was going to say, I'm really glad you said that because thinking back to The Guilty Have No Pride, especially, weirdly, I think more than Burial and more than Nada, there are songs in there that you can hear the seeds of what will come later. You know, something like All Alone in Her Nirvana or Heaven Street. You know, there are elements in there of what would come. It's almost as if Douglas had this sound in his head, but hadn't worked out yet how to get to it.
Exactly. And of course, like with, the original members being a part of it, he didn't have the whole entire spotlight too.
Yeah,
But it's funny that you say that because I remember like going through the album again for the first time in a while and not really remembering that Heaven Street had two versions on that
yeah,
album. And the
yeah,
first one that plays is like I think the second version from like when they had originally released Heaven Street, like just it had that traditional post-punk sound, but there's a
yeah,
second version that they play before the next Heaven Street, like the original Heaven Street,
sure.
where it's like, oh wow, this is like the only song on like The Guilty Has No Pride where you can hear Douglas having a precursor type of sound that will eventually be the traditional Death in June sound with that like monotone type of like speaking. Because of course, like I guess for the most post-punk like sounds, it's more kind of like chanty and like a little bit uh higher raised voices. But it
Yeah.
was the first time I don't know why I didn't pick it up the first time, but I'm like, oh wait, the second version of Heaven Street sounds like what Death in June eventually will become, and that's like what made me even more intrigued. And like Heaven Street is also just a really good song in general.
Oh, it's a great song. I wonder if there's a confidence thing with it as well, because in terms of Douglas growing into his own identity, because the monotone vocal, which obviously Douglas kind of perfected by the time Death in June was very much his project, um, is a fair hallmark of a lot of the more dance-oriented post-punk, and especially a lot of the revivalist bands of now. The monotone vocal is a big part of that. And I wonder how far it is that because Death in June's kind of, you know, air quotes, classic period is predominantly acoustic driven, I wonder how far it was. Most people don't expect to hear the monotone drawl over acoustic instruments. It's almost as if, the power of a traditional post punk arrangement gives Paul, kind of gives the necessary backing for somebody to then not traditionally sing over that. And I wonder if there was an element of, well, if I take all of that out, it's just going to be me, doing this monotone singing. And I do wonder if there was like a kind of an internal struggle between, well, I really want to do this thing over here, but I'm not sure whether it's going to work necessarily. And like I said, you can hear elements of what would come later on those early records, and yeah, this one particularly.
Yeah. So I think I guess I'm not really listing it down, but I just wanted to add that in because that's like why it was hard for me to like essentially I don't think I have a proper top five albums, but in essence, I'll just start out with this. Symbols and Clouds. Now, this kind of might be a cop out for me because it's essentially a compilation album of both um but what ends when the symbols shatter and rose clouds of holocaust. But what I found like I recently realized like what that compilation project was, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. I'm just gonna like have this be my favorite Death in June project
Yeah,
because it has like literally like because but what ends when the symbol shatters and rose clouds of holocaust, they always have been neck and neck for me for years, and I was like I never knew how to like properly like say that. Like essentially it was just gonna be, but what ends when the symbols shatter and then rose clouds of Holocaust. And then I discovered symbols and clouds. And so I was like, you know what? No, this is gonna be my favorite album because it has both of best worlds from both of those albums during that time period. And I think that it objectively kind of is his strongest like sound with those two albums. And
I
so
agree.
having and despite the fact that like knowing that it was probably constructed also due to the fact that he like I guess at that time like he probably stopped his association with um David Tibet because there are like because if you do listen to but what ends when the symbol shatter the song there's two songs that actually have David as like the main vocalist on them but they're
Yeah,
not on there anymore and so I've always listened to but what ends when the symbols shatter primarily without David being there and then once I discovered like he was on there I was like oh dang that's I mean I guess it's somewhat petty because it's just like yeah, they weren't associating with each other. But it makes sense if like you don't associate with somebody, you don't really want them prominently on your biggest albums,
yeah,
I
and
guess.
I
But
think as well, there's probably an element of copyright with that as well because a lot of artists, in order to regain copyright, will re-record old material.
yeah,
And it's not quite the same as that here, but I do agree. I think there are two. If you've wandered in here and know Death in June, you either don't know Death in June at all, or you only know them because of the controversy around them. Two things I would highly recommend for you. Firstly, Symbols and Clouds, which Dreas has talked about, or the one that's more widely available and which sadly is the only physical release I have in my collection because they are so hard to get hold of and so expensive on Discogs and websites like that, is the Discriminate two-disc compilation, which covers 81 to 97. I think that's a really fantastic. It's a two-disc best of, if you like, and it really is. I think it covers all the eras really nicely, and it's got all my favorite tracks on it. So until some sort of box set remasters appear, if they ever appear. I'm quite happy to just keep going with that because it's a great collection.
Yeah, I still haven't listened to the Discriminate CD because I think for me, I've always been listening to Death in June in like a playlist type of way because
Yeah,
again, there is so much to get through, kind of like with Current
yeah.
93 and other bands who have such a prolific discography. It's like, yeah, like I didn't like I really wasn't appreciating like all the albums in a whole for a good majority of the time when I was like deep diving into Death in June, mainly because it's just like I just want to like get through as much as possible so I can have a
Mm,
clear-cut idea of what this band is and how
yeah,
it, formed the sound. And so I was just picking my favorites. But now that like I've been trying to go through some of the albums by themselves, like in recent time, like my affections for some of them have just like either increased or just slightly changed or altered because
yeah.
again, it's just like knowing the lore and knowing the different connections with like other bands. It's like I'm again, it's like I did get into Death in June just so I can understand Current 93 more. And now it's like I'm able to like understand the different correlations between when they were working on projects with each other and who popped up on these albums to assist and who popped up on other albums, and realizing like yeah, they were kind of sharing like their albums with each other to a degree. But
Yeah.
so Symbols and Clouds, and it's funny that like this probably was your least favorite, but I don't know, maybe it's just like the edgy part of me that just loves like fuck you albums, but I just really enjoy All Pigs Must Die. It's just I don't know what it is about it because it is a very like just kind of just kind of impulsive album, literally just to get out of his contract deal. And while like obviously I can see like how people are just like yeah, the experimental aspect of it really just doesn't do it like for most people. Like even though I don't listen to it all the time, I don't mind it. But mainly it's the first half of All
I
Pigs Must Die that I
I was just
love.
gonna say it's why I think perhaps it's why I have a problem with that album because the first half is really strong and it really drops the ball after that and it feels like such a wasted opportunity.
Yeah,
Um,
but I get
because
what
there
he
are
was
some
going for. I get what he was
disappear in
going
every
for.
way, enemy within, there's
Beautiful.
so much potential in there.
Yeah, and it's definitely like more stripped back, and I feel like, but I don't know. I don't know what it is about it. Maybe it's just a personal thing. I don't know. Like I just really like All Pigs Must Die because if there's any Death in June album, if I were have been presented with Death in June, knowing like the this controversy that surrounds them, and someone hands me this album, yeah, this is exactly what I think like this album like would sound like, what that band would sound like if this was
And
my first representation of it. It's just
that
a
goes
very
back
crude, but I don't know. This is something I like about the crudeness of it. But
that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with a lot of the music being so pretty that makes it hard to reconcile listening to it with the controversy around it. All Pigs Must Die bulldozes that notion very, very easily. Um, but yeah, it's like I said, there are some moments on that for me. I don't out and out dislike it. It feels like a bit of a lost opportunity, but yeah, it's you could argue that it's perhaps um, depending on depending on your view of Douglas and why he goes for the things he goes for, you could perhaps argue that All Pigs Must Die is the album that sums up Death in June in terms of Douglas's attitudes.
yeah, if
Um,
anything, I feel like the reason why I liked it is because it's what I feel like is what he really feels inside, for better or for
yes,
worse, because it's just
yes,
like it's very the album cover is very just egregious and kind of quirky, obviously, because it's like him with these pig dolls, and I remember hearing a conspiracy theory saying that like one of the pigs is dressed up as like naughty, as like a kind of diss towards David. I'm not sure how true that is, but like it was just interesting. It's just like again, a lot of it really, a lot of my interest when it comes to certain albums really does come with the lore around them because I've done so
Yeah.
much research. So like that added on knowledge, I think has personally like altered like my perceptions of certain albums from them just because like it just creates an interesting narrative around everything.
Yeah, and
Um,
again, I'm glad that that's in there for you because, like I said, the world that summer made it pretty high for me, and it's my number two, and I love that album. And again, like reading comments and things from people, it's not one that seems to come up a lot as, you know, favorite amongst people. So it's nice that we've got two slightly to the left field um, cuts in there.
and
But
then hmm,
it, I don't know I don't know how you wanted to approach the topic of the symbolism because All Pigs Must Die, like you say, is very egregious cover, but it also is perhaps the greatest example of this was a period when some of the reissues started to appear, all
yeah.
of which had alternative covers, and all of which, almost all of which, had Douglas wearing that outfit, you know, in
Yeah.
a fairly hastily thrown together picture of him, in the woods or in the snow or yeah,
Yeah, the symbol of like again, it's because I entered into Death in June very slowly, and I had to actually do research on certain symbolism and like what he's like the camouflage that he's wearing. Like before then, I had no idea like what that was. Just thought that like was how he dressed, and apparently, I guess this is like what you know people in the Third Reich would wear during like battles or something like that. And again, it's just like having all of that, like whether it's like what he's wearing, his logos, like the totem cough, like all that, like I was completely like ignorant of understanding like where's the danger in it. And then once I
yeah,
actually looked it up, it's like, oh, okay. Now I see. Whether it's like his the camouflage, the certain lyrics, or even like the fact that he literally has an album called Operation Hummingbird, which is
yeah,
literally also called the Night of the Long Knives when Hitler had, you know, killed a bunch of other Nazis that weren't really part of like his specific regime of how he wanted to go about it, and just they all got slaughtered. So it's just like again, like upon doing a lot of like death and June research was really going back to like just doing research on World War II and Nazi Germany in general, because there's just so much stuff that like it like that is just its own like history project in itself that like you just really have to be a history buff on that time period to like know. And like
yeah,
while I have like studied like Nazi Germany throughout my life and was always like curious of like knowing that like there's something poignant about that time period during the world and how it's like still has bleed into this day and age. It's just like,
yeah,
all right, like it's like these are the representations of the echoes of that time period, I would say. And
yeah, and
it
it's
creates its
important.
own narratives and shifts as time goes on.
It's important to note here as well. Obviously, the Totenkopf does predate the SS.
Yeah.
However, what's the first thing you think of? It's that. Now, the Night of the Long Knives or Operation Hummingbird um, it wasn't the first act of violence um, to kind of go a little bit into this, there were two groups of uh, paramilitary there were two primary, or three, if you count the Gestapo, I suppose, primary paramilitary wings of the Nazi Party. There was the SA and the SS. And the SR was headed by a man called Ernst Röhm, who was a friend and an ally of Hitler, um, but whom Hitler saw as a bit of a problem
Yeah.
insofar as um, his ambition to merge the SR with the army under his own leadership, and was quite an outspoken advocate of a revolution amongst the German people, uh, to kind of redistribute wealth and many other things that we couldn't possibly get into here. And without wanting to put too fine a point on it, the Night of the Long Knives, although acts of violence had existed within the party and outside the party before this, the Night of the Long Knives, in which was 1934, was perhaps the first truly public, not public event, but perhaps the first one to get into people's heads about what was happening, because it's a very unpopular thing to have to talk about, and I don't know how it's taught in schools these days. But from what I learned and from subsequent uh, hobbyist interest in not only the Second World War, but the period between the First and Second World War, and period of reparations, of rebuilding, of apologist, the apologist stance that Germany was forced to take as a result of, the Treaty of Versailles and things like that after the First World War. Hitler came up at a time when nobody really knew what direction to go in, and he was promising uh, a strong return for Germany. He was promising people that why should we be the ones apologizing? And he offered a very poor country work and bread, which were two very important things to everyday people at that time. And then something like the Night of the Long Knives then shows his true colors to the world. Um, so to kind of bring it back to point, if you call an album Operation Hummingbird, whatever your politics are, that immediately is going to send out a signal to anyone who knows what that phrase means. And I raised my eyebrows at it the first time I saw it, because, you know, while I share a fascination of this period, and it's a very interesting and important period in history, and while I like Death in June's music, there is always going to be a part of me that goes, this isn't, this is not okay if you're if you're the loving kind, which I am. So, yeah,
Yeah, it's just like figuring all this stuff, like literally while researching Death in June, it's just like I have to be knowledgeable about what was going on in the Second World War and with Nazi Germany. And it's just like that's what makes it like while it's very interesting on like how like I'm getting all this source of information, it's what makes like it hard to talk about this band very objectively through the music, because you have to mention the symbols and what certain things he's representing, even if he's just being cheeky about it. But it's just like, again, from interviews that he's had, from the unmasked one or like the brainwashed one, it just seems like it does seem like he has his own particular viewpoint and personal beliefs that revolve around those like that time period. And essentially, it seems like he's been interested in this stuff since he was a child, because apparently his father was fighting against the Nazis like
yeah,
during like the the Second World War. So you also
Yeah,
have to take in consideration Douglas' point of view, since he's like so more closely to that time period or has a family member that was associated in that time. He was around all that memorabilia. And aside from that, knowing that Douglas definitely had like a weird upbringing that probably, you know, affected his mental state in a very bad way based on how saying that his parents hated each other and everyone in his family and his siblings were just kind of like their own like alien, and they grew up around with that type of negative energy
yeah,
around like just the family aspects. I can assume that like whatever reason he got into that imagery was for is probably a combination of childhood trauma, unchecked mental illness, in kind of using, that type of aesthetic to emulate probably what he actually did feel inside. It's just unfortunate it's that type of imagery, and he goes on to like make music that people generally like, but these, whether you want to call it a fetish or just morbid curiosity or literally a combination of all that, that may eventually have just turned him into what most people assume him to be, because he's just like, well, if people think I'm this way, then I'm just going to double down on it because I don't really give a fuck. And and again, to go back to Kanye, I feel like that's also where his mentality went from him starting off making the music that he did, like with College Dropout, very uplifting, like empowering like black culture, but also being alternative. And then essentially it's just like doubling down on like his Nazi sentiments, because that's the best way he feels like he can get his points across, by doing egregious things and just siding with it, because it's just like, well, why the fuck not? I got nothing else to lose type of deal.
yeah, and this is partly my take on it as well, that Douglas is fully aware of um, what this notoriety has brought him. And there are always going to be people who will never be able to see past it. And I don't, I don't disagree with people who think that. I think the problem is, especially nowadays, we live in a very, very, it's one thing or the other uh, society.
With no
Largely, I think,
chance of nuances.
yeah, largely, I think we live in a very black or white era, possibly more than ever before, where there aren't allowed to be shades of grey. And I think that, without wanting to put my millennial hat on, I think social media and the democratization of the internet has really, really fueled that. It's a
Oh,
bit
by
like,
far.
and talking about the doubling down on the perception of Douglas as a figure and him kind of going, if you think I'm this, then I'll just be this. Um, I think this speaks to a wider point of people who perhaps feel like they're doing themselves a disservice by just following the accepted through line through life, right? Which I think, it's like the fact that we are in a with the fact that we're in 2024 and we're seeing more people discussing flat Earth theory than ever before is, I mean, hilarious to me. But I think the point I'm trying to make with that is, because we have all this information thrown at us, um, and we're kind of constantly looking for, society is very liquid, especially at the moment, and people kind of looking for an identity will automatically want to do something that isn't following the status quo. And that is where even if they don't necessarily believe it at first, they allow themselves to be because it makes them anti something.
Yeah.
Um, it makes them alternative in their mind, and that's how the rise of flat Earth theory has happened. And I think it's a little bit like this, whereby I do think Douglas, a little bit like David Tibet, is a scholar of a particular very, very heavy topic. Whereas David is, I mean, if you know a bit about David's background, you'll know that a lot of those early Current 93 records, as Tre and I have discussed, really are a purging of the way he grew up. Um, and so I very much see David as a scholar of religion and of religious iconography. There is stuff in Current 93's music that I've had to go and look up and research because religion is not kind of it's not an area of expertise for me at all. I grew up in I went to a Church of England primary school, but after that, outside of a few discussions in philosophy, when I got to university, that's as far as it went for me. Whereas with Douglas, I think he's really a scholar of modern history, particularly this time period. Like you said, he grew up in a really tumultuous environment. All of this symbolism and all of this memorabilia will have been around him. That was the case with a lot of people of his generation, and I think that's important to acknowledge as well, because if anybody's seen the Joy Division documentary, they will know that Barney, Bernard Sumner, guitarist in Joy Division, grew up with a lot of this stuff in his house as well. A lot of the punk musicians from the time wore a lot of Nazi symbolism purely for shock value. I'd like to add, Susie Sue is one of my absolute favorite musicians and singers of all time. She did it a lot and has subsequently said that was a stupid thing to do. We did it to piss people off. We did it to shock people. I'm not a Nazi. But because we live in this very it's black or it's white world at the moment, a lot of these artists are now being pulled up on things like that and saying, we can't have this. It's 2024. And while I agree, we can't have that, people aren't examining the context and a lot of people are not prepared to dig to find out what the real uh, story is. And I think the problem people have with Douglas and with Death in June is that there is no definitive answer. You have to kind of either try and figure it out for yourself or accept the fact that there isn't going to be an answer. And
Exactly.
you can either choose to carry on listening to the music or you can say, too rich for my blood, and out you get. And I empathize with both sides of that because there's like the video by Lines in Wax. If you're watching, by the way, which you're probably not, that video is brilliant. I've subscribed to your channel. I really like what you've done with some of your black metal videos as well. Um, but there's a part in that video where he sort of talks about, um, I think it's Brown Book, uh, as being, you know, that was the first time he was thinking, there's something going on here, which is interesting because if you read Douglas's statement that he had to make, which I have up on the screen here. Tesco organisation Germany that I must provide a statement clarifying my work with my group Death in June to a German government agency responsible for censorship in Germany. I think it's quite important that we perhaps link to this statement in the comments for people because it's too long for us to read out here.
Yeah.
But it kind of, what was my point here? I think my overarching point was you're not going to get an answer directly from Douglas. And while this statement is very good and I think clarifies a lot of things and put my mind at ease about a lot of things, it also raised more questions than it answered for other elements of what we're discussing here. I
Yeah.
do think there is an element of Douglas very knowingly playing with these ideas because he's been able to sustain. I don't know how much, if any, financial gain he's made from Death in June over the years, but it's certainly kept people talking about Death in June.
Yep.
Um, and I do wonder if there is a part of him that enjoys baiting people with that.
Yeah,
Um,
and just goes to like the trolling aspect that I think I remember him mentioning on the brainwashed interview where it's just like I can afford to play with people now and I have no regrets. And so it's just like I think he whatever his mindset with Death in June and how people perceived it, I think he was already dead set on how he was going to go about what he was doing a long time ago. And the pushback just kind of fueled him more. And I wouldn't say it was probably for, you know, the political or like, ideological reasons. There may be elements of that, but I think it's a personal thing with him, or maybe just a specific like disdain that he has for just probably honestly like existence. Just base it just seems like because he has admit that like he's not really a happy person and he only finds that in very small dosages of his life. And essentially this is just someone who's maintaining this dark element in his soul through this type of uh artistry. And
yeah,
while there's plenty of people who do that on a daily basis with their music, I think with Douglas, because the imagery is so poignant and like it does affect other people because certain people will gravitate towards his music, whether he's about it or not, because it represents something that they stand for. And even if they know that he's not fully for it, hey, it's just like, well, it still looks cool and I'm still gonna sport it. And he does nothing about it. So it's just like it's like kind of I forgot what the concept is called. It's like something that's like neither evil nor good. It just consumes. And I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but like overall, it's just I've accepted that I'm not gonna get an answer when it comes to this band, along with like a lot of artists and bands that I like who have very intense controversy around them. Like I
yeah,
don't really think it's like you said, it's either you listen to it or you don't, and either way is fine. It's just, getting involved into it like intensely, thinking that you need to like make a statement out of it. I feel like you're just getting yourself into a wormhole of like, just um an antagonism because, it's just
yes.
human nature. Human
I'm gonna
human
I'm gonna preface what I'm about to say as well by saying that um, I think that, firstly, the context in which Douglas kind of came through in music, he came out of the punk period. So there
Yeah, with
was
Crisis.
So yeah, so that was an interesting thing. So obviously he came out of the punk period, which was all about shock and all about, you know, F you, F the system, um, etc. That's always going to be part of you, um, as is the symbolism that he grew up around, his family life, and so on. Crisis were an openly left-wing group. They played a lot of anti-Nazi benefits. They played with Crass, who were as left as it's possible to be, still are. Um, they supported bands like Magazine, Bauhaus, so they were really in there. Obviously, Tony Wakeford, who would form Death in June with Douglas, perhaps didn't share all of those left-wing views. And that's now been borne out, through several articles that I've seen uh, about him and people he's associated with. Um, he obviously went on to form Soul Invictus. It's also worth noting as well, another member of Crisis, Luke Rendell, went on to be in a band called Theatre of Hate, who also got accused of flirting with Nazi and fascist imagery. um, possibly strong-armed by the fact that Kirk Brandon, the singer, who I've had the pleasure of meeting several times, I always go and see him and his whichever band he happens to be playing with whenever they're in town because I love his songwriting. Had bleach blonde hair in a either a big quiff or in a comb over. That was his look, um, and you know, um, so that will have formed part of Douglas's musical identity. However, where I think it departs a bit from that is the fact that um, he he clearly doesn't want to give too much away insofar as what he believes. It's all there in the lyrics, right? How you choose to interpret them that's down to each individual. It's subjective. Do you interpret it in this controversial way, or do you think, well, what's really going on here? What I was going to say is, and I was going to preface this by saying, this is just me kind of thinking out loud now. Um, most music that attempts to deal with heavy subject matters gets a rough ride, right? Whether it be metal, whether it be hip hop, whether it be, NeoFolk, anything, um, and is held up in a very, very, it's poured over and analyzed a bit like we're doing now. And usually the mainstream media will decry it and say, this is what is causing our kids to commit crimes. This is what is causing people. We mentioned Marilyn Manson earlier on. This is what's causing kids to commit atrocities and do awful things, right? And yet, it's perfectly acceptable to go and watch a horror film where people are butchered and awful awful things happen in those, and that's visual. You're looking at that, you're not just listening to it. If you go to the Vatican or to any major place of worship around the world, you're going to see a lot of quite brutal iconography there, and that's real. This is stuff that really happened, and but that's not perhaps given as much airtime as music and artists who don't necessarily fit into a mold that people deem to be acceptable get poured over a lot more. And I think that's why Douglas has probably gone, you know what? I'm just going to leave you to think what you want to think.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. It again, when it comes to the complexity of like talking about a band like this, like I feel like there's no real fluid or solid way to like talk about it without having these like analysis on a social level, because it's just like it really reflects a lot on those constructs. And
Yeah,
I think there's a lot to be learned from it. And if people are willing to like, look at it from a nuanced view, but it's just like it's really understandably hard for some people to look at this from a nuanced view, especially like say if someone who was Jewish, like, being presented to Death in June as like, hey, look at this very nuancedly. It's like, no, you can't do that. Like
yeah,
that's trauma. That's a lot of trauma. It's like
exactly. And
there's a lot of trauma around this imagery, and I don't blame anyone who doesn't want to go into this. And it's just like, and you know what, like, because for me, obviously, like this is definitely music that like would not make sense for me to go into just purely based off my race. But at the same time, as a person, I love music and I
yeah,
never attached music to any social group or construct. I mean, yes, to degrees, but like I'm a music like person to the degree where it's just like I want to hear everything so I can understand the construct of like
yeah,
what my human existence is. And that's a very small mindset to like not small mindset. That's a very like small like a niche of people who really just purge through anything that's even like against
Absolutely.
like them as a person. And so it's like so yeah, it's very difficult for me sometimes, but like I know that what's keeping me to want to understand and actually probably learn from this is the fact that like I love this type of music. I love experimental music and I love avant-garde music that pushes a boundary. I love music that I've always loved music that's pushed boundaries. And for example, as someone who's been in the hip hop, I've listened to the most violent forms of music through that genre, mainly its subgenres. Sadly, hip hop is always seen as like, gangster and like, street stuff when it's like it's not that all the time, but
Yeah,
just because of racial and social politics within America, that's kind of built for it to like be seen as that, and for people to see people who look like me as that, it adds to, the oppression of like people of color
yeah,
by propping up a form of hip hop that like is violent and destroys communities. But like us, we were talking about in the beginning, it's just like, but the music is still good. Like there's
yeah,
artists that I listen to who openly talk about murdering other people and they get murdered, and then someone else makes songs about them and they get murdered, and it's literally like murder music. And it's the most popular form of like hip hop music, sadly, in America. But I would be a hypocrite to say that I still don't enjoy it. Like it's just I mean, I'd be a hypocrite to say that I don't enjoy it. So it's just
yeah,
like, yeah, so for me, it's like getting into this band is not it's not the fact that it's hard because I can listen to harsh stuff. It's just once like the politics around it get very egregious and it has a certain, stain on your image. That's like when it's just like, all right, I got to be a little bit more like strategic of how I'm going to discuss this band, even if it's purely just for historical purposes. And so
yeah,
with that, I'm just going like I honestly I really can't do a top five because like there's so many things from each album that I like and I've always found like interesting to listen to. So it's just like I said, Symbols and Clouds, but what ends when the symbols shatter and rose clouds are holocaust. Number one favorite, like those two albums at the top. Most people would agree, and most people would say those are one of the best neo folk albums in general. And I highly agree that like if you want to understand neo folk, those are the albums to go to. Yes, it comes from someone with a very particular uh uh image, but it's just like if you're willing to want to understand, like, that's your own choice. But for me, like I'm just gonna quickly just make a little thesis for it. The Guilty Has No Pride is like just a good representation of like the, three of the members coming out of crisis and
yeah,
them expressing like that sound during
yeah,
like the post-punk phase. Burial honestly sounds like a cop-out album to me. It's kind of like very B-sidey, so I didn't,
yeah, I
after
agree.
listening to it again, like there's some stuff that I do like a little bit, but for the most part, it's like it's not really like imaginative in my opinion. It's just like they just put new songs and through live and alternative versions off of stuff from The Guilty Have No Pride. Nada, this is also like I feel like an interesting album in the fact that like yeah, it is like their a fan favorite. And I come to like grown to like it a little bit more now that I'm into like I like their post-punk sound now that I've been able to marinate with it for a bit. But like I do feel like there's a lot of experimentation happening on here that you can obviously tell is going to lead into the neo-folk sound. And The
Sure.
World That Summer, um this is where you start seeing David Tibet like associate with Douglas P. Moore and like partner with him on some of these songs. And
Yeah,
I do like this album. I do want to say
love
it
that
is in
record.
my top five, but I feel like since it's still trying to figure out its wings, like it's
Yeah,
not, there's a certain consistency about it that's not doing it for me,
yeah,
but it's something that I still like because I can see the transition and what eventually would
yeah,
become neo folk. But some of my favorite Death in June songs are on this album, like
me too.
Break the Black Ice and uh I think Rule Again, where it's just like I have seen on that far hill. I just love that melody. And
Yeah, it's
then
beautiful.
The Wall of Sacrifice. I'm kind of like torn between this album and the fact that like again, and maybe this is like what Um, I don't know why. It's like it's probably how you feel about All Pigs Must Die, where it's just like I really like how the aura and concept of this album is stringed together. I just think some of the song placements just, kind of don't do it for me. And something
Yeah,
about
I
Hello in this version of Hello Angel, I just really don't like. I prefer the
no,
one
I don't
version
like
off
it.
of
I don't
Swastika
like it.
Swanati.
Yeah.
But we got you were gonna say something. What were you gonna say?
No, I was just gonna say that I'm the same with you about Hello Angel. I kind of think they could have just left that off entirely on Wall of Sacrifice, and it would have been a far superior listen all the way through without it.
Yeah, it's just like just how like his pitches on there are just like, and this is a total musical standpoint for me. It's just like, dude, like that was sloppy singing. I'm sorry, that was just
Yeah,
really sloppy singing. But of course, also fan favorite songs on here, and my favorites, Giddy Carousel and Fall Apart.
yeah,
And also, I would have to honestly say, I think when it comes to my favorite Death in June album covers, it has to be this one. It's
yeah,
just, I don't know, there's something about it that's just like so badass. Um, but again, for me, it's like I like that album a lot, but I'm stopping from liking it more just because of like song placements. But that's just a personal thing. Some other stuff, skip some of these. Capo, this was a collaboration project between him and hold up. I like Capo in the sense that it feels like it's a slightly a detour and like you're hearing different elements of more soundscape stuff
yeah,
or just like sound bites instead of the neofolk sound. And I can definitely say it feels like it kind of leans into like what also he would be doing on like Take Care and Control or Operation Hummingbird, which I know
yeah,
some people don't fully like, but I actually don't mind it. I think hearing his voice in a different setting is kind of soothing to me in the sense where I feel like I'm actually enjoying like other elements of other artists that he's associating with that I probably can just get into and just he's just kind of like, just a part of it, even though it's like primarily, still presented by him. Um, mm, and I know you did not like these areas of albums, but I actually really like Take Care and Control. I don't know what it is about them. I think it's just more of like there's a soothingness of like the melodies that I like more. Now,
yeah,
his voice and singing is definitely more washed out, which I can
yeah,
understand why people don't like it, and I would agree. But I think because I like the production on here from keep going. Let me go back to Wikipedia so I can figure out the names. But with Take Care of Control, he's collaborating with Albin Julius,
yeah,
and I don't know something about just how Albin composes like the sounds like it appeals to me. Now, yes, to the Death in June discography and sound, I can see why it probably doesn't fit with certain people, but for me, I really don't have a problem with it. If anything, it feels like I can like I'm just I don't know. It's just very soothing. There's a lot of like soothing like song structures on here that like just kind of stick with me because at first I really didn't listen to this album as much because I could tell it didn't have the traditional neo-folk sound, but I gave it a few more listens and I was like, you know what? This album is actually not that bad. I can't fully remember most of Operation Hummingbird, but I do know that like it does seem like it's probably made with Albus and it kind of just sounds like Take Care and Control Part 2. So
yeah,
they kind of just blend together with me. All Pigs Must Die, like I said, one of my top five favorite albums for them. And again, I know I said I wouldn't like rate them, but it's just like upon discovering Death in June, I just kept coming to like the first batch of songs on a consistent basis. I still listen to the first batch of songs like almost every day because they're just very catchy. They could be expanded more, but like I don't know, something the minimalist aspect approach about like that album. I don't know, it just sits right with me and
yeah.
I like replaying it. It has good replay value for me. This one collaboration album between him and Boyd Rice, Alarm Agents. Now, I would say while this is probably merely like a more Boyd Rice oriented album, just due to the fact that it's mainly his voice throughout it, the instrumentation playing of Douglas is phenomenal in here. And also, yeah, this album, to get back to controversies, yeah, there's a lot of things on this album that really just makes me just like cringe and
Yeah,
just like,
yeah,
okay. It sucks that I like some of these songs and that have those dog whistles, but it's just like it's just again, it's just like I upon getting into this band, I already knew what I was getting myself into, so it's just like it is what it is. But Abandoned Tracks, it's just a compilation album. It has some pretty nice, interesting song ideas that could have turned into an album concept. But nice little, listen if you like want to hear like possible things he probably could have done if like he really went full with those tracks. The Rule of Thirds. I know this is one of your favorites. So this was an album when I first initially did my first run through of Death in June. I I didn't dislike it. It just didn't really do much for me at first.
same. No, same.
But over the past 2 years of like listening to the playlist and listening to some of the songs that I like off of this album, I realized, no, actually, this is a really nice album to listen to. And like, ironically, despite the fact knowing like the lyrics are still pretty melancholic, like it's the most happiest Death in June album. Like at
Yeah,
least
it
in
is.
sound, like it's
It
very
is.
uplifting in how he plays the instrumentations. And so this is honestly what I would show somebody who, is on the fence about them, but if they want to like listen to something that's like more, just, calming, I probably show them this or just show
Jesus
like this is like
jumping jurisdiction. Like I can hear the mamas and papas in that.
a wait, the who, the Mamas and Pop, like is
The
that a band?
mamas and papas, yeah, who did California Dreaming.
Oh yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Like you're right, because like this really does give me like just like beach vibes, like vacation, like California type of vibes. It's very interesting. I would also say it's definitely one of the most unique uh Death in June albums, just due to
yeah,
the
for
fact
sure.
that like it doesn't sound melancholic as it is, but
Yeah,
it's just it's just interesting. Um, Peaceful Snow. And I'll lump in the Snow Bunker tapes with this because they're pretty much like Peaceful Snow is like the official
yeah,
album, and the Snow Bunker tapes are like the original B-sides with like a more neo-folk version to it because he did it with guitar first. But Peaceful Snow over time, like at first, like I liked the idea, but I think I still was really attached to the acoustic guitar singing. But again, just due to the fact that I just kept listening to it over and over again, it's just like the songwriting and like what he's saying. I feel like this is like the most clearest in his emotions that I feel like Douglas is expressing himself. And the fact that it's just literally all piano is kind of like
yeah,
reminds me of like when Current 93 did like with Soft Black Star, it's just all piano. So I feel like that's
yeah. And it's funny actually because I'm not so keen on that album, but as we discussed in Current 93, Soft Black Stars just shot into my top 10 with Current 93, and I really didn't expect that.
yeah, it's over time that album has grown on me. And I think it's just like after listening to Death in June for so long, primarily with just like hearing all like the fan favorites and like the more darker elements. I think enjoying these albums is more of like, all right, I feel like I don't really have to think about, the controversy around him. It's just more like there's just elements of this album that's just like makes me feel peaceful and uplifted. I don't know.
Yeah,
It feels like he's not really taking himself overtly that serious anymore,
yeah,
or at least like he's just getting to an age where, you know, the egregiousness of him trying to like prompt Death in June for its reputation is just kind of subsiding. He's just literally
yeah,
just doing whatever at this point. And then the Snow Bunker tapes along with that, like while I do like hearing like the neo folk elements of this, and I do like that type of version of it, it's obvious that these are still B-sides because like the tuning and the
Yes.
EQing is just not right. Like it's just like these were just like sketches, obviously, but
Yeah.
it's still nice to hear. And then we get to the last and final one, Essence, which comes out around 2018, and we can probably end the video soon after this, but this will be my like last statement on like just my history of Death in June. So I remember when this album had came out, and again, like, so 2017, I had listened to Rose Clouds of Holocaust for the first time. And yeah, I was like, all the alarms just went off for me. I was like, okay, I probably should stay away from the. And then the next year, and I'm pretty sure I still listen to some songs every once in a while because I did like the sound of Rose Clouds of Holocaust. I was just like, I just don't want to associate with whatever they got going on. So like, and I think only due to the fact that I still was like huge, I was a big Current 93 fan, and I wanted to understand the neo folk sound, but it was just, I still was just at a point in my life where I just didn't really want to take that step. So I just kind of like, you know, messed around with the sprinkles of some Death in June
Yeah.
songs. But then when Essence came out and I saw the album cover, I was like, yeah, I probably definitely should stay away from this band. Although, ironically, figuring out like the album cover technically is of a sculpture of like an executioner's mask, but
Yes.
we can see what Douglas was going for. And knowing the fact that like he was that's the when he made his statement to Germany, and apparently was just getting um canceled and banned from most parts of the country except for Israel. Uh I think this was like the album cover was just more like, this is just my opinion. I really don't know, but it's just like a big fuck you, whatever. If you think I'm that, I'm this then.
I was
And we
also
haven't
going to
heard
say,
anything from him since then.
do you think because we haven't heard anything since, and because this was when he made the statement to Germany, that that sculpture was symbolically saying this is the end of Death in June. This is the execution of Death in June, you know?
Honestly, like that's a good theory. I personally believe so because like when I had heard it, I mean I heard through the first three songs because I remember I was working at McDonald's in Minneapolis, and like I think I because I had listened to enough of Current 93 and some Death in June songs on Spotify, it told me like, oh, a new Death in June album just came out, and I just saw the album cover. I was like, what the fuck? And listened to the first three songs, but I was just like, at that time, I still like the Current 93 sound more than the Death in June sound
Yeah,
of neo folk. So I kind of was just like, I'm not really gonna bother with this. And then the album cover was taken off of Spotify for a good few years,
yeah.
right after, and then it just popped back up. So not really sure why. I mean, I don't really care either way, but it's just again, it just adds to like the polarization of this band. It's just like it's like you feel like you're by participating and listening to them, you're gonna experience this like very egregious like uh essence of like there's a lot of push and pull with like how this band is represented on streaming services.
So to kind of wrap this up, um, I I've been Trey and I have both been obviously kind of mulling this over for quite some time, and we've been looking at the symbols, we've been looking at the lyrics, we've been listening to the records, working out how we can do this. Um, I've also, I've got a few of my own interpretations, and I've also looked at a few interpretations that others have made, either through videos or comments here and there. And this one I thought was really beautifully articulated. So I'm going to read this out by Charles Kimbot or Kimbot, sorry if I've butchered your name, on songmeanings.com, right? And this is a website that I was vaguely familiar with, but I didn't realize was still active. And this is on Rose Clouds of Holocaust. And as I started reading it, I thought, yeah, okay, I see where you're coming from. So, And they've clearly put a lot of thought into this. So I think reading it aloud is probably the best way to do this, and quite a nice way to wrap the video, I think. Rose Clouds of Holocaust is one of the most beautiful pieces of art about World War II, often misconstrued as denying or supporting the Holocaust by shallow readers or moralists. I'm very aware of Douglas Pearce's far-right sympathies, parentheses, I don't know if he is a literal Nazi, close parentheses. But this song is not supporting the Third Reich by any means. The song is also not a simple symbol of condemnation of the Holocaust, like many art, like much, I think he means like much art is rather than like many art is, but an artistic reflection on what happened. My personal take: Holocaust comes from the ancient Greek language. It means burnt offerings or fire sacrifice. The image of pink clouds rising from the ovens is beautiful and complex, to say the least. It contains, from the Nazi point of view, the idea that Jews are the root of all evil, and therefore sacrificing them with fire to history, so to speak, is warranted. However, they eventually found out they aren't a Holocaust, parentheses, a justified sacrifice, but a lie. It is a reflection on the supporters of Nazism and the way in which they fled reality with their romantic view of history and the goal of the Germanic peoples, but in a way which is not moralistic or pigeonholing them as metaphysically evil. But festivals end as festivals must, parentheses, pagan harvest festivals taking place at the end of summer, also made use of human sacrifice sometimes. Did they regret what they did after they saw that winter come nonetheless and they didn't have enough food? The hooded crows of Rome, parentheses, fascist Italy, the falcons of Zagreb, parentheses, collaborationist, I'm going to say this wrong, collaborationist Eustace party in Croatia helped murder many people under German rule, close parentheses. I find the solemnity in the phrase, but festivals end as festivals must, especially beautiful. It is a tragic acknowledgement of someone who realizes that the romantic lie under which he has been living has to end, and he has to come to grips with the non-rosy reality of what has happened. I think that's a brilliant, brilliant explanation.
Yeah, like I wouldn't agree more because like it's a lot of what I feel like Douglas has done is really interweaved shock value with legitimate facts of history in his own like self, you know, fulfilling prophecies of like what he wants for himself and how he projects his artistry, which, as an artist myself, I can always support. It's just, yeah, it's just there's just so many entanglements of things that like I think because people want it to be one way or the another, there really is no closure on how to like actually go about like, you know, enduring this ban. I do feel like, unless like you really are for, just music or the supposed ideologies, yeah, you can just like listen to this like simply. But for anyone who is like curious but don't want to align with it, it's just like you have to like just be very, very knowledgeable about the historical aspects and symbols that surround, a lot of the lyrics and just things that he and other people during that time period of like the UK underground, were into and were doing, and also what
Yeah,
also probably affected this. Because you got to think about the fact that like, despite like the political aspect of his like imagery, like essentially there still has to be some elements of like spirituality embedded in
yeah,
this, or paganism, because like from what I do in my research on like Nazi Germany, like it really was Hitler was just like disguising like the Third Reich at like, or Nazism as a pagan thing and infiltrating into like as like they were Christians based on my
yeah, for
research.
sure. I
So
mean, it's
there's so many things to go around that we can't get to them in just like one video, or just like even
no,
like
and
one documentary. Like there's so many things that surrounds what he's pulling from, and you can
abs
spend affinity
absolutely.
trying to interpret it.
And I think we made this point in one of the Current 93 videos that paganism is part of, certainly here in Europe, and here in the UK, paganism predates Christianity in a lot of countries here. Um, and it's kind of woven into our history, whether we like it or not. And that did involve, unfortunately, human sacrifice, and animals and many, many other things like that, which are uncomfortable topics to discuss. But I think because they're so far in the past, they they don't come under the same scrutiny as uh, what happened between the end of the First World War and the downfall of the Nazi Party, because it's still less than 100 years ago. So it's still in recent memory for a lot of people. And just to the point that we made earlier, the next comment down under what I've just read is Mr. P is definitely isn't denying the Holocaust, but he'd love it if you thought he did. So again, that whole thing of there is going to be a degree of him about facing the critics and saying, you know, if you choose to believe this, who am I to say that you're wrong? Um, and like you said, I think you could never ever, you could never fully analyze and draw conclusions on this stuff in one video, one documentary, or one book. Although I would recommend it doesn't focus on these things, but I would recommend anyone go and read England's Hidden Reverse. We've mentioned this in several videos now for a good summation of this scene, if you want to call it that. But there is no definitive explanation to any of this, and I think it's why Death in June get talked about in the way that they do. Douglas gets talked about in the way that he does, and why there is still this fascination. Because to kind of bring things full circle, the music is in in many parts beautiful. It's well written. It's well constructed. At times, not always, but at times it's well produced and holds up really well, given how old some of it is now. Um, and I think has quietly been quite influential to people who would perhaps not want to publicly admit that they were influenced by it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to leave it off. And last thing I want to say, off the last album that they released, um, I think my favorite song on there is The Trigger. And I do feel like a lot of like what that album is just kind of a conclusion. When I listen to this album, uh I can't really say if it's like my favorite or not, but it just kind of feels like a last statement. And
Yeah,
especially from someone who's getting older, who's definitely past his prime, and it's just kind of just like, accepting like what he is and what his public perception has been perceived to be, because it doesn't seem like there's really much else he really wants to give, because like it, it seems like it's just like the ship is sailed with the Death in June um what do we call it, like just series or just lore. And it's just like
mm,
whatever he's doing outside of this, we'll never know. Maybe he might pop up with something again, but it does seem like this album is a representation of like someone who's just kind of concluding and saying it is what it is at this point, and you can make for it what you want, but it's just like he's done. So
yeah. And to kind of you know, kind of cap this off, there's another article that I think we ought to link to for people on the big takeover, called Accidental Protege, an attempt to clear the confusion over Death in June,
oh yeah,
which
I
is
remember reading that one.
it's a fantastic read. And there are a lot of points in there that I think are really, really valid. And I think, um, you know, uh, I'm going to leave people to make their own minds up. But as the writer quite neatly articulates, that Douglas is not G.G. Allen. He is not Prussian Blue or Screwdriver with a K, who I must admit I've not heard of. White supremacists never miss an opportunity to vocalize their idiotic opinions, whereas Pearce rarely gives interviews, and when he does, he often makes little sense. It's quite prescient, I think, and I think he that's a really good article because it really does attempt to look at the more nuanced explanations behind what's going on. So yeah, another one I think is worth linking to. Um,
Yeah.
that
Are there
about wraps it up. Sorry, Trey, go on.
Oh no, yeah, I was just like clarifying. Yeah, like just send. I'm gonna get all those articles. Send me some of them too, just so I can like link everything. And I
Yeah,
highly, again, back to like that one video we had mentioned in the beginning. I would highly recommend people look at the video, uh, the politics of Douglas P. And for anyone who's new to this or this band or is is aware but is like doesn't know how to like interpret certain attitudes around them, I would highly recommend just watching that video. And
yeah,
even the
absolutely,
person in the video recommended like going through his comment section and seeing like the nuanced perspectives of this band, because I think honestly just off one video alone won't do you justice. It's just doing research and coming up to your own conclusions. And I think that's the best
absolutely,
way that you can go about like at least being in the know or aware about this band, and whether you want to enjoy the music or not completely is up to you. This is not a promotion of them. This is just a pure analytical analytical video to one, not just understand Death in June, but understand counterculture music, music that pushes boundaries, and ultimately neo-folk music. Because whether you like it or not, Douglas P is a pioneer of this sound and has influenced people to this day when it comes to like that area of music, even if it's just like regular folk music. Like there is influence from whether it's coming from the post-punk sound to all the way up until now. There's definitely always going to be like people who are influenced by something, and whether they agree with like the motives of that person, is neither here nor there. Just look at this as a historical like analysis, and I'll just leave it at that.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, thanks everybody for watching. This has been a long video, but it's been on the docket for a while now, and I think it was important that we tried to cover some of these things off in a fairly balanced way. I appreciate we didn't really get into talking about lyrics too much and dissecting it in that way, and that was largely, I think, because the Lines in Wax video does a really excellent job of that. And I think really rather than just kind of repeating a lot of those things, um, I think Trey and I's goal with this was a bit like he's just said, to provide a little bit more context and nuance to some of these things. And if you're trying to figure this stuff out for yourself, watch and read as much as you can, listen to the music, and draw your own conclusions.
Yep. And with that, guys, that's the video. Thank you guys for listening or watching, and we will see you guys in the next one. Peace, guys.
Take care.